Good afternoon. How many people recognize this log cabin that you see up here on the screen? Yeah, it's over in the campus of the University of Notre Dame. This is the original log cabin. It was built around 1834, burned down in 1856, and then was replicated and has been on campus. This picture down here is a painting by Luigi Gregori, and it shows a bunch of Indians around Father Soren and the log cabin. But this picture can be very misleading and maybe lead to some folklore that's not really true. Let's take a look. The log cabin that's over there was not the only log cabin that served the missionaries at the time just before Soren arrived here. There were 4 of them. And in fact, the one that was here when Soren got here might have been the least used of the 4. You were given this before the presentation and asked to see if you could identify. Today's presentation is going to concentrate on these 2 individuals, Leopold Pokagen and Father Stephen Baden, and the incredible story number 1, of how they met and lived together for 2 years. The second story that I'm going to tell you today is the story of these 2 individuals, Father Edward Soren and the bishop who was over him when he arrived here in 1842, Bishop Hallandier. It's an incredible story, a story that I have not read in any of the Notre Dame historical records, but it is in the Michigan history books. So, the other people here are authors, and we'll talk more about them as we go on. But in this first slide, which I've given you copies of, you have the 7 missionaries that served Leopold Pokagen. Leopold Pokagen is going to be our main figure today. The first missionary to him and his band of Pokagen Indians was Father Stephen Baden, who came here in 1830 and left in 1836. So he was here for 3 years. He came from Detroit, but that's not the diocese he was from. He spent 6 years here ministering to the Pokagen Indians, and he went after 2 years or 3 years, and he got the help of a Belgian from Detroit, a Father Louis de Seal, who came down and helped him minister to these Indians. Unfortunately, Father de Seal died suddenly in 1837, and at that time, the Diocese of Vincennes had been created in 1836, and Bishop Proutet was the bishop there. And in fact, we find that Baden is leaving when Proutet is made bishop. And he will appoint Father Benjamin Pettit to take the place of Father de Seal. In 1839, when Father Pettit died, Father Proutet also died, and the bishop was the second bishop of Vincennes, Bishop Hallandier. We're going to use a color code of green and red to talk about the policy back then of Indian civilization or Indian removal. And after Father Benjamin died and Father Hallandier takes over, he appoints a Father Stanislaus Bernier to minister to a very small remnant of Indians. They had all been removed in 1836 to 1838, as we'll see. And Father Stanislaus Bernier becomes the missionary, but up in Michigan, where Michigan was a diocese by itself. So we have this priest from the Vincennes diocese having to travel all the way up to the Dowagiac area and minister to this band of Pokagans. In 1842, we find Father Soren arriving and being assigned by the Bishop of Vincennes to this property that Father Baden had purchased, where the University of Notre Dame now sits, 524 acres. Father Baden had bought this and left it in 1836, and it was essentially abandoned after 1836 and never used again until Father Edward Soren arrived. And when he arrived in 1842, there were no Indians left at all in the Indiana. We'll be talking more about that. But once Edward Soren gets here, for some reason, he feels like he has to minister to this remnant of Pokagon Indians up north of Dowagiac. So he appoints a Father Theophile Marivold about 1843, maybe 1844, to go up and be the permanent in-resident minister to these 200-some Pokagon Indians. Unfortunately, 4 years later, Father Marivold quits the CSC, and then Father Edward Soren appoints, who Colin talked about back in June, this incredibly holy missionary priest, Father Louis Barreau. Father Barreau goes up and takes the place of Father Marivold and does a wonderful job. However, he doesn't last there very long, and we'll be telling that story. So that's your lineup. I want to kind of get to the conclusions we're headed to as why this research. In story number one, we're going to be talking about how Chief Pokagon incredibly meets Father Baden and leads to what I think is the ND log cabin and the presence of Notre Dame in this area. Notre Dame never is located up in this area. It's located south in Vincennes. Had not Chief Pokagon and Father Baden met and ministered to each other. The second story that I'm going to tell is one that's I'm sure you've never heard it before, because it's never told here in Indiana. Bishop Hallandier ends up stealing, around 1839, 1840, steals Pokagon's land, tries to steal, up in the Dowagiac area. And he's taken to court by the Pokagon Indians, and it takes 7 years, but he's found guilty of fraud. And so that's going to be an interesting story. You won't find it in any of the books here in the Notre Dame Historical Circle, but it's in the Michigan high school history books. We'll go on to talk at the end about Father Soren, caught in the middle of this civilization removal controversy that reigned here for over 10 years. Was Father Soren a good missionary? If you go up to the Pokagon Indians, they'll suggest that he was not a good missionary. Surprised me when I heard that from them. If you read the books here, Father Marvin's book, you get the idea that he was a good missionary. If you look at that painting by Luigi Gregori, you think that one of the great things that Father Soren was minister to these Pokagon Indians. But let's talk about this story. This is Father Marvin O'Connell. You see his book up here. He was a historian for the University of Notre Dame. He was born in Minnesota. He was a diocesan priest who came here and spent many years as a history professor at Notre Dame, and died here at Holy Cross Village just a few years back. He is famous for his Edward Soren biography, and it will be one of the main sources of information that I give in this presentation today. There'll be 3 other. We're going to begin with this story number 1, and the source of this data comes from our second author, which is Cecilia Vane Buchner, and she describes the story how around 1830, Father Baden, for whatever reason, wanders down to the Bertrand area here, right on the border of Michigan and Indiana, and lives, and prays for 2 years on the same property that Leopold Pokagon and his tribe of about 250 Indians, which are right along on the west side of the St. Joe River across from Bertrand. She did this wonderful piece of work back in 1930, and it was part of her MA dissertation, and the title was The Potawatomis of Indiana and Michigan. In this first story, Father Stephen Baden, the first missionary, he was born in 1768. He was born in France, immigrated to the United States, became a priest here in the United States. In fact, he was the first Catholic priest ordained in America in 1793 by Bishop John Carroll, and ministered for many years in the Cincinnati, Kentucky area, but retired and went to France and lived there in retirement for 12 years until in 1829 he decides he's going to come visit his brother, Father Vincent Baden, who was stationed up in Detroit. Now, at the time, Detroit was a sub unit to the Diocese of Cincinnati, and they were under the Vicar General up there, Father Richard. But anyways, Stephen Baden comes to visit and somehow wanders down to Bertrand, and we have this fortuitous meeting of Father Stephen Baden and Father Leo and the Chief Pokagon. Leopold Pokagon, more about the same time as Father Stephen Baden, 1775. We don't know the exact year, but he became a Potawatomi. He wasn't a Potawatomi all his life. As a young man, he became a Potawatomi tribe member, and at the very young age of 25, he became a sub-chief to this band of 250 relatives of this 3,000-some Pokagon Potawatomi tribe, and he lived there in the Bertrand area. We believe that he was captured at a very young age and made an orphan, and the rumors are that he came from the Ottawa tribe up in the Petoskey area of Michigan. Now, we're going to go on to say that I strongly believe that's true, and that he was a Chippewa/Ottawa Indian. He was raised very Catholic by Jesuit and Detroit priest in this little village just north of Petoskey called La Arbor Croce. Today it's called Harbor Springs. But we're going to see Leopold living along with 3,000 other Potawatomi Indians, but they're going to be under the ministry of a Baptist minister. So let's continue with this story. So, why was Leopold a Catholic? Well, if you look at all the information that we have on his lifestyle, how he knew the Catholic prayers, how he recited them when Father Baden came down, much to Father Baden's amazement, every day his band would meet at his log cabin. They would pray together, and he was always going to Detroit and begging for a black robe, a Catholic priest, to be assigned to his village. And we believe not only was he Ottawa, but he probably was raised in this same village that we're going to talk about in a minute, La Arbre Croce. Did Leopold know Father Vincent Baden? We're thinking maybe he did, because Father Vincent Baden, ministered to the La Arbre Croce, which would have been Leopold's ancestors. The final thing here is we're going to find that the practices in the La Arbre Croce, Ottawa, are very similar to the way Leopold conducted himself down in Bertrand. And one of the things, unlike most of the other Indians, he practiced complete temperance, complete abstinence from alcohol, which is going to be extremely important to him remaining here, whereas the other Potawatomi are all going to be removed to Kansas. One of the reasons we think that Leopold, and we know about Leopold being a possible Chippewa, comes from this Chief Blackbird, A.J. Blackbird. He lived 1814 to 1908. He was raised up in the Petoskey area. They spelled it a little different than we do now. And he remembers being baptized by this Father Vincent Baden at the age of 10 in 1825. And that's when he was baptized. That would have been the same year that Leopold was being made a sub-chief down in Bertrand. But if you read the history of those Ottawa Indians, as explained by A.J. Blackwood, they're very similar to the way Cecilia Vane Buchner describes life in Bertrand. Continuing with the story, let's take a look at a map here and talk a little bit about what happened after 1830. Father Baden comes down to this area. This is the Bertrand area right on the border, and he builds a log cabin. We think probably sometime after a year or so, living with Father Baden, he built his own church, and they have mass every day. Instead of in Pokagon's home, they have it in this log cabin, which is on this little plot of ground. It's right on the border of a 3-mile creek called Pokagon Creek. At the same space, just north of there, the rest of the Potawatomi Indians are going to school under this Reverend Isaac McCoy, a Baptist minister, and we'll talk a little bit about him next. But once this cabin is built in around 1832, Father Baden brings down a second priest, Father DeSille, and together they build this log cabin that's called the one at Notre Dame. And we believe that that log cabin was more of a school than it was a worship site. Within a year, the two priests, DeSille and Baden, build a third log cabin, just like the other two, and it's down in the Twin Lakes area, which is about 6 miles south of Plymouth. And down here, there seems to be another 3,000 Potawatomi Indians. And within that band, with that group of Potawatomi, there's this Chief Menominee. And he, very similar to Leopold Pokagon, he's a Catholic, and he wants a black robe as well. So Father Baden and Father DeSille split their time between Bertrand and Twin Lakes, also trying to start a school here in the St. Mary's Lake area, but it's going to be on settler property. As I was mentioning, everything on the west side of the St. Joe River was Indian territory. They had ceded all this territory to the settlers. And so this log cabin, which was built around 1834 here at Notre Dame, was intended to be an orphanage. Now, an orphanage is like a school for children, not necessarily orphan children, but as Marion Casey described in June, it was like the Minim School that ended up starting Father Soren's ministry here in the South Bend area, a school not for college students, but for younger children. Now, we need to talk about Father Isaac McCoy. He was a Baptist missionary. He came here around 1822 to the Niles area, and he was using funds from what we're going to talk about, the Civilization Act that was passed by Congress. And he starts this place called the Carey Mission, and it's located about 1 mile west of Niles on the west side of the St. Joe River. And the head chief of the Potawatomi was this Chief Tepinabee, and he was head chief over all 3,000 of the Potawatomi that was north of Michigan line. And he has all his Indians, are the ones that want to go to school in this log cabin that Father Isaac, or Reverend Isaac McCoy, had built. Sometime during this time, after he settles here in 1822, Isaac McCoy decides he can't civilize the Indians, and he now encourages them to all move out west to Kansas, where they can have their own civilization and they can be away from the alcohol influences of the settlers who try to get them drunk. And so he buys lands in Kansas in 1828, and that's the direction that the Potawatomi are headed when enter Father Stephen Baden. And probably one of the reasons Father Baden comes down here is Leopold's begging to stay. He does not want to go to Kansas, and he wants a black robe priest for his band at Bertrand. So we need to talk about Indian removal versus civilization. It's a huge topic, similar like we're big controversy today over whether we should build a wall or not. Indian removal as a group of Americans that wanted the Indians to move west of the Mississippi River. There was no way of civilizing them. Another group wanted to continue to try to settle them and adapt them to our way of life and have them integrate within the same area that they now resided in. But in 1830, this Pokagon Catholic group is living along with Father Baden, wanting to stay here very bad. And unlike the 1822 Potawatomi had been going to this Baptist ministry, Pokagon is definitely Catholic. He wants no part of the Carey mission, and especially in 1826 when he finds out that McCoy is now moving the tribe out to the west. One of the great historians that I've run into is this Dr. Ben Segunda. He's a professor now at the University of Michigan. He's written a doctoral thesis back in 2008, and it's probably the best 700 pages on civilization versus Indian removal up to the time of Father Soren from the 1800s. And I learned a lot from this professor. So let's condense what this professor and what was going on in the time. We go back to event number one. This is a busy slide, but follow this. Event number one is the time of Washington, right when our country was created. There's the first battle that the Indians, there's always fights between the Indians and the settlers that are moving to the west of the Allegheny Mountains. And Ohio is trying to become a state. And the chief event is this Battle of Fallen Timbers. And the Indians get beat, and it precipitates this Greenville Treaty of 1795, where the Indians agree to cede some of their land to the settlers, and in return they get money, they get annuities, they get food, they get supplies, so that the Indians and the settlers can coexist. At the same time, around 1803, that Ohio becomes a state, President Jefferson is buying the Louisiana Purchase, and a lot of people say that one of the things in the back of Jefferson's head when he bought that purchase was that it'd be a great place west of the Mississippi for the Indians to be removed to. So we think that Jefferson was for Indian removal, unlike President Washington was for coexistence. Then the event number two happens, and that's the start of this War of 1812, and we know the story of Andrew Jackson down in Mississippi with the Creek Indians, and then we have our own story of William Harrison of Tippecanoe and Tyler too. He's up here first. He's in charge of the Indiana Territory, and he ends up having a battle with Chief Tecumseh, who was organizing all the Indians in this Indiana, Michigan area to start an uprising to prevent any more ceding of the land, any more white settlers from coming out this way. But both Andrew Jackson and William Henderson prevail in huge battles over the Indians. And then we have event number three. Congress passes a civilization fund. They now want to actively try to civilize, and they're paying ministers, missionaries like Isaac McCoy, who in 1822 comes on over to Niles, Michigan, and starts a mission with the purpose of schooling them for civilization and learning to live like American settlers, farming and so forth. Then we come to event number four. As we already mentioned, Leopold's here. He wants Father Baden to come, and it's 1830, and event number four, he meets Baden, and he petitions to stay here and not move with the rest of the Potawatomi out to Kansas. But by that time, Andrew Jackson is president, and Indian removal is taking over any civilization policy. And so we have the Indian Removal Act passed in 1830, and most of the Indians now are going to have to leave for Kansas. Event number 5, we have, as we mentioned, Bishop Prout starting the Vincennes Diocese. He dies within 3 years. And he was very much a civilization. He wanted to civilize the Indians. That was his ministry. And he dies and is replaced by this Bishop Allen Dier, which you won't read that he was for removal, but we'll show you the evidence from the Michigan historical records that he was very much for Indian removal. And in 1842, when Sorin comes over here, indeed, Indiana, there's not an Indian left in Indiana. And there's only one small band that's still here, and that's the Pokagons, who, it's an interesting story how they got permission to stay up in the Dowagiac area, which we're going to start to call the Silver Creek Mission. But Michigan becomes a state in 1837, and that's going to lead us into Sorin arriving here in story number 2. Story number 2. We go back to why we did this study, and we've already answered the story of story 1 with Pokagon and Baden and how important that was. Baden getting this land here and the whole ministry that he has on either side of St. Mary's Lake to these Potawatomi Indians. And then we start into story number 2. Before Sorin gets here, we have this fraud that we're going to talk about. It's in all the Michigan history books, but it's not in any of the Notre Dame history books, nor is it in any history book that I've read in the Indiana historical records. Finally, we'll discuss a little bit about Sorin as a missionary. What role did Father Sorin have in this huge dispute between civilization and removal? Where was he at? Was he caught in between this bishop? Going back to this map, we're going to say that first we're at the year 1833. In 1833, we have Pokagon and Baden being here 3 years, living right here in this log cabin, right here on the Pokagon Creek, ran right into the St. Joe River. We had most of the other Indians going to this Carey mission run by the Baptist minister. And down south here, we have all these other Potawatomi Indians living south of Plymouth all the way down into the Yellow River to Tippecanoe River, and this one band of Menominee. So that's 1833, and in 1833, the Treaty of Chicago is signed, and that is the end of the Indians' life in Indiana. The treaty says they have to all move out west of the Mississippi by 3 years, and so in 1836, they have to be gone, every Indian from this, with the exception, there's an article left in the treaty that says Pokagon, because of his relationship with Baden and being a Catholic, he is told that he has to go up to Little Arbor, Croce, and he can stay here. So, the Carey mission is gone, 1833. The Indians are starting to head west. We come up to 1838. 1838, we said, is 2 years after the Indians had to be removed. And there's very few Indians in Indiana. And we have this significant event of September 1838 down here at Twin Lakes, when all of the Potawatomi, either in Michigan or in Indiana, that still is here, they're forced by gunpoint to Kansas. And we're going to maybe take a field trip down to this area where this Rochester historian, Shirley Willard, will tell us about. She has a huge museum record of this event. But in any case, in 1838, there's no cabin up here. The log cabin is gone. We think maybe it moved over to the east side of the river. The log cabin at Notre Dame is empty. In 1836, Baden left. He had 2 nuns working at orphanage. They both got married to Indians. Vincennes became a diocese. Prout showed up, and this cabin is empty. no Indians in the area. In fact, they're all in hiding for fear of being forced out like these other Indians were in September of 38. The only cabin that now exists of these original three that has Indians, and is this cabin up here that was started by Father DeSille in 37 and ministered to by Pettit for a short time up here in the, as we mentioned, north of Georgia, about 6 miles up near the Sister Lakes. We have this village called Silver Creek, where these 250 Pokagon Indians are living and have a black robe, Father DeSille and Father Pettit, before they lose both of them in 1839. So let's move on to the time of Soren. Now we're in 1842, and something significant has happened between 38 and 42. Pokagon has learned how, just like the Ottawa up in Arbor Croce, they have learned how to purchase land and apply for citizenship. And so they buy land 1835, 1836, and we think at the behest of Baden, because Baden's buying land there for Notre Dame, and he teaches them how to buy land, and he tells them, you got to get out of here. They're removing all the Indians by 36, and so Leopold makes plans to move up here and begins to do so in 36, 37. As we said, Carey Mission's empty. There's no Indians down here. And we got Soren coming, and he takes over this log cabin. And a lot of people don't know it, but it's only used as a church for about 6 months when Soren builds a second log cabin there, a bigger one. And the log cabin that you see there today was used then as a carpenter shed until it burned down in 1856. The interesting thing that we're going to talk about here is the difference. This is the Detroit diocese, and below the state line is the Vincennes diocese. We find out in the Detroit records that Hallandier tried to steal land in 1840, and we're going to go into that story in a minute. He tried, after Pokagon moves up here, buys this land, Bishop Hallandier tries to steal it, along with the priest that he assigned there to minister after Father Pettit. Let's go to story number 2, but to prepare ourselves for story number 2, you have to know that the period from 36 to 39 was incredibly terrible events for the Potawatomi. They all began to leave before 36. Remnants are forced to leave after that. Pokagon has gone now north to Silver Creek. Baden is gone at 36. A new bishop has taken over. This orphanage has failed. Father DeSille has died. He's buried here in the log cabin. He died right in that log cabin, and he was ministering to both the cabin up in Bertrand and the cabin down at Twin Lakes. And then we have Father Pettit dying after he takes some of the Potawatomi out to Kansas. He ends up dying in St. Louis, and at the same time, Brute dies. That starts story number 2. Before we get to story number 2, I had no idea of what happened with Hallandier committing fraud until I got this book called The People of the Three Fires. The whole story changed. In 1840, Pokagon was dying, and Father Stanislaus Benier had been assigned by Bishop Hallandier to minister to his Silver Creek mission up there, and for whatever reason he tries to steal that land away from Pokagon and is taken to court, and that becomes story number 2. And this is what's in that history book. It's hard to believe, and when I read it, it just set off bells. Excerpts from the book. Leopold had always wanted to assign 40 acres up in Silver Creek to be a church and a school, and as he's dying and Father Stanislaus Bernier is ministering him, he gives him a deed for these 40 acres, but what does Stanislaus Bernier do? He changed the deed to 674 acres, and he goes over to Cass County and he files it under his name and Bishop Hallandier's name. And the history of Michigan don't mince words. They say Bernier was also actively involved in removal of ties at the time, and his actions did little to suggest that he was fully devoted to the welfare of the Catholic Pokagon Potawatomi. The sorry episode did little credit to Bernier, they misspell Hallandier here, and several other priests. And we're wondering who these several other priests that were serving the Pokagon interest, which later will be Father Soren. Anyways, this court case drags on all during the time that Soren's here, up to 1847, 1848. 7 years. The Michigan Supreme Court, Michigan becomes a state, it has a Supreme Court, and we find that a ruling against Father Bernier and Father and Bishop Hallandier states that they've committed fraud, and we find that 674 acres are returned to Pokagon, and Hallandier suddenly resigns. I needed a second source, so I went to the history of Cass County, and I find the same story. In fact, I find it to a worse case. You have copies of this. I'll let you read them. We'll just read this one paragraph in blue here that I have on a separate slide. From page 51, the history of Leopold was sadly victimized by the priest in charge of this church. That would be Bernier. When approaching his death, Stanislaus Bernier induced Pokagon, when he was very sick in the autumn of 39, to give him a deed for 40 acres of land. That's something that Pokagon wanted to do. But it's as a price for receiving absolution. The deed ends up being for 674 acres instead of 40. The priest in this record goes to Cassopolis in great haste on a Sunday. They know the date. And he's urged that the document be immediately filed in the county seat by this priest, Stanislaus Bernier, and it's 674 acres being taken away from Leopold Pokagon and his wife, Katessi, and made out to Bernier. And then after that, Bernier goes back up there and retitles the land, backdates it to 39, and puts it in the name of Bishop Hallandier. They didn't expect this lawyer, very friendly to the Indians, very friendly to Pokagon. He helps the Pokagons take it to court. He was at Cass County Circuit Court at the time, and then he became the first Supreme Court justice, and he carries the case all the way through to its conclusion in the Supreme Court, where Hallandier are accused and found guilty of fraud. So here we are. So Soren's here trying to establish a university. He's ministering up here to this cabin at Silver Creek, cabin number 4. A convent has been built in Michigan. When this bishop down here refuses it, Soren apparently goes to Bishop Lefebvre of Detroit, and he petitions to build the convent here, and Bertrand, so the convent gets built in Bertrand, and 2 nuns get assigned up here with Father Marivaux to take care of the Indians at Silver Creek. So what's going on here with Soren going up and creating a deal with the diocese and then taking over the ministry that Hallandier tried to destroy? So at the same time that we read in the book by Marvin O'Connell that Soren always had problems, but not mention of any kind of fraud and anything about this act that he commits up in Silver Creek. You find Father Soren always fighting with Hallandier, and he's also fighting with Moreau, and this bishop is writing Moreau and telling him how bad Soren is. So it was a terrible situation, and if you can read that book, Soren, it will tell you all of this. So ending story number 2 here. Why is this fraud not in history? I have no clue, except thank goodness for this Governor Ransom who's a civilization, he takes it, and these two scoundrels, Bernays ends up gone in 1841. He tries to go down to New Orleans, and they wouldn't have him. As we said, my hero, Pokagon, he dies in 41, and taking over for him is his son, Peter Pokagon. But he's not at all like Pokagon. He drinks. And he's the first son of Leopold, and apparently Father Soren is not a particular hero during this bad times that are going on under Peter Pokagon, because records in the book says that Father Soren was having a hard time and made some mistakes. So we'll be talking about what role did Soren play in the demise, because quickly after 1841, Silver Creek starts to fall apart and the Indians all scatter. So, the stakes. One of the things we know for sure is, from the Michigan records, is that soon after he is convicted of fraud, he resigned at the age of 49, very young age. He disappears to France, where he lives another 30-some years. And if he wasn't desperately trying to remove the Indians, certainly his assistant, Father Stanislaus Bernier, who was assigned to Silver Creek from 39 to 41, did nothing to help that cause up there. And Father Soren, by the same token, he assigns Theophile Marival. And if you read the book, Soren had nothing good to say about Father Marival. He didn't want him at all involved in the university, and he sends him up to Silver Creek to be the minister up there. So Father Marival was apparently not a very well-liked priest by Father Soren, and he goes up there, and Peter Pokagon is not a very good character like Pokagon, and the two of them, Father Soren's not understanding what's going on up there, or he didn't want to understand. Enter Father Barreau. Father Barreau came in 1846, and as soon as Marival disappears, he gets assigned to take Marival's place up in Silver Creek. No sooner does he go up there and try to get things squared away, Father Barreau we have this fire at the Minims, and a large part of the university almost burns down in 1849, and Father Soren sends Barreau for 18 months over to France to raise money to replace the Minims. So just when he's starting to help out up in Silver Creek, he's pulled away from that mission. Shortly after he comes back from France, going back to Silver Creek, which he wanted to do, he loved that ministry up there. The book by Soren says that Moreau sends him to Bengal, to the new mission that was being set up in Bengal, the Bangladesh mission, and we're really wondering whether Soren at that same time was asked to go there, and he refused, and we're wondering if Moreau was offered in his place, but Moreau insisted that he also wanted Soren to go as well, and that's a separate story. Anyways, once over in Bengal, Moreau quits the CSC, gets sick over there, and he comes back to the Detroit diocese, becomes a diocese priest, and he's assigned back to Silver Creek in 1859. Unfortunately, very few Indians, just a few relatives, just a few children of Peter Pokagon are still there at the time. So, we're going to maybe take a field trip up to see Silver Creek. You have Colin's article on it, and this is the thing that's right outside the church there in Silver Creek. Some of the names that are buried there are all Irish settlers that came over as part of the railroad construction from Detroit to Chicago. And we're coming to the end of our story here. But let's review the significant events. Father Soren declares Peter Pokagon chief around 1846, 1847. Not a good move. As we said, Peter was never recognized by the Pokagons as their chief. Singawa was, but for some reason Father Soren wasn't aware of that, and all the records indicate that he dealt with Peter Pokagon, and that it wasn't always so very pleasant. And Father Marival is dealing with them up in Silver Creek, and then we have Marival leaving, and then we have Barreau being removed, and then a significant event in 1851. The wife of Leopold, Contessa Pokagon, dies, and now any control that over the Indians, Peter Pokagon, had been lost at this time, and it ends up in 51. All non-Peter Pokagons leave Silver Creek under this chief Singawa, and we'll tell you who this Singawa chief is and how he's related to Simon Pokagon in a minute. Anyways, most of the Silver Creek land is sold to the Irish, and I'm left with the question, why did the Pokagons disown Peter? Because if you go up to their records, unlike our book here in Indiana, there's no record at all that Peter Pokagon ever existed, and yet he seems to be one of the main reasons that the ministry up there failed. We'll talk, that's a separate story in itself, but we're left with these very important questions. That why do Pokagons have a sad memory of Soren? I have no clue. Perhaps because of Marival, perhaps because of Helen DA and Soren's association with them. I'm not sure. They won't tell you straight out. They have no memory at all, Peter Pokagon, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But maybe the reason they write Peter out is because he has a bad history, and Simon, his third son, Leopold's third son, has a brilliant history. Why do historians leave Helen DA fraud out? I have no idea, except that when speaking to some of the authors of Better Dame history, they were told not to write about the Indian mess that went on up there at Silver Creek, and that's why you don't find it in the records, because the history department at Notre Dame seemed to discourage that, including Marvin O'Connell's book. Anyways, we're left with, we get the implication that memory, legend has it that Father Soren was a great Indian missionary priest. The Pokagon historians say no. We have a further controversy comes up. Where did Father Baden get the money to buy this 524 acres? Well, some people say it was Baden's own money, which I think. Other people said, which some people say, I don't believe that. Other people say it was civilization funds, so that this land was purchased for the Indians with civilization funds. Anyways, we're left with this irony. Was Father Soren a poor missionary to the Pokagons? I doubt that he was a poor missionary. He certainly had people below him and above him who were very anti-Indian or very poor ministers to the Pokagons. And we see this picture that implies that the Indians greeted Soren when he came here. That's not true. And but we can remember Soren as one that built a great university. Nobody can ever take that away from him. One final item here. We're going a little bit over time. Peter Pokagon. The Pokagons don't want to talk about him. He had 8 children. They were baptized. They got records from the Silver Creek Church today that Father Soren's priest baptized his children. We know that Peter Pokagon's, the land up there was in his name, and he refused to turn it over to the individual Indians. he was incorrectly made chief by Father Soren, and that really caused a lot of internal conflict within the Indian community up there. As the Singawa, the real chief, leaves Silver Creek once Katesi dies in 1851. Now, who is Singawa? Just briefly, we have this tree here, and I won't go into this in very detail. Here we have the family tree of Leopold Pokagon. He was married. His father was the daughter of Tepinabe, married the daughter of Tepinabe's brother. They had 4 children. We have no records on Peter, or he was called Paul. We do have records of all of his children being baptized at Silver Creek, but they have no records at all of his ancestry. We have Simon Pokagon, who marries, Simon ends up marrying Lenaldal Singawa. She is the daughter of the real chief of these Indians. And so we find Simon leaving Silver Creek and getting his fame up in the northern area where the Indians then scattered to north of I-94 up in the Hartford area. And his family lives on today, but none of these are anywhere and yet they're all in our Silver Creek records. So that's a strange situation that I don't think I'm ever going to get the answer to, because the Pokagons have obliterated those records. It's time for questions and answers. During the question and answer, I want you to refer to these 2 slides. They're summary timelines, and we can then, if you have a question within there, we can talk about it. So I'm going to open it up to questions. One of the key things here that's really hard is to follow the timeline. When did things happen? And if you don't follow the timeline carefully, you don't understand the reasons things happen. And so I've tried to put them into a summary slide here, and if you have any questions, perhaps you can point to a part of this summary slide too and ask for clarification. So, questions?